It wasn't a bird or a plane. It could have been a Valentine's gift from Fang Fang, but it was definitely a Chinese spy balloon, and it floated over our country spying for 7 whole freaking days before it was finally shot down over the Atlantic. That communist balloon was allowed to travel more freely in and out of our country than an unvaccinated tourist. This is what happens when your president is a weakling and/or likely a Chinese beneficiary. And worse, to save his own apples, Biden wanted to cover up the balloon situation until the damn thing was so obvious they couldn't hide it anymore. Because Joe didn't want to put a damper on Secretary Blinken's planned and now canceled trip to Beijing. This is also typical of this administration, a clown show through and through, now with balloons too. How fitting. Borders left open, skies undefended, and fifth graders learning how to twerk from drag queens while Chinese students study quantum physics. Anyone think this is going to end well? If you think that balloon was intrusive and problematic, wait till you hear about TikTok. That balloon was the size of 3 buses, but that little device in your hands and your kids' hands is far more intrusive and dangerous. Bet on that. But most of you don't care because you learn stupid dances on it and how to cook your chicken and flippin' cold medication. Useful, I'm sure. But look, it's as plain as that giant-ass balloon flying overhead. China is flexing its muscles because it can. They say it was an accidental situation and just a civilian weather balloon that strayed way off course. Yeah, sure thing. The Chinese wanted an overwatch of our nation and our military assets, all to document a cold front moving in. How considerate of those lovable communists. But I've got so many questions here, so who better to have on deck than former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Trump, KT McFarland. Oh, KT, I have so many questions for you, but I want to start out with the most simple one. If this was flying over our airspace for several days, why did it take so long to shoot it down?
Well, the excuses that the Biden administration gave are, number one, well, if we shoot it down, there'll be a lot of debris. It might hit somebody. And number two, oh, well, it wasn't that important. The intelligence they were gathering really wasn't that worthwhile. Look, all those are just silly mistakes and silly, it's just a lot of subterfuge. This is a big deal. The Chinese penetrated American airspace. What they could have used that balloon for and what they might be intending to use it for at some point in the future is nuclear weapons, for example, in addition to spying. So it's a really big deal. And the Biden administration, as you very well pointed out, had a lot of time they could have dealt with it. And yet they refused to do it. It's worth telling you, Tommy, that in the last couple of days, a number of Trump administration officials, we all have been talking to each other, State Department, NSC people, Defense Department people, intelligence community people. And we've all asked each other, did you know about these supposed balloons in the Trump administration? Anybody tell you? And we have all agreed nobody knew anything about it. So it brings up sort of 3 points. One, did the military, were they running political cover for President Biden? Did they say, oh, well, it happened during Trump too, so therefore it's not that big a deal? Number two, was the Pentagon deciding that they weren't going to tell the Trump administration people? Did they know it was happening 5 years ago and they just decided, well, we're not going to tell Trump people? Or number three, did they not know? I mean, are they now just saying, oh, well, maybe during the Trump administration this happened too? All 3 of those are really horrible prospects. One would be the military is politically compromised. Number 2, the military is politically compromised. And number 3, the military is pretty incompetent if they didn't see a balloon that people in Montana could look up at the sky and see that there was a spy balloon up there.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because it did not take long for the media and for the Biden lackeys, for lack of a better word, to jump up and say, you know what, this happened during Trump and there were 3 balloons. Maybe there were 10 balloons. Maybe Donald Trump was in the balloon. I mean, quickly, they wanted to spin a narrative and it's like, but Trump is worse. That's been the story of this entire administration is everything that they've done wrong, Trump has done worse or Trump created the problem. We know this. But the fact that a local paper in Montana was the one that said, this looks a little suspicious, and the world really had to find out about this and be confirmed that this was a Chinese spy balloon by a little paper in Montana. I mean, I'm from the Midwest, so it's a feather in our cap, but my goodness, you'd think that something that big and that obvious, the Biden administration wouldn't think it could cover up, but they certainly did, and they knew about this long ago and just let it go.
Yeah, that's the unsettling thing is that they saw it coming. They knew it was coming. They knew it was over the United States. And they probably thought they were going to get away with not commenting on it. And as you pointed out at the very beginning, what they really wanted was a yet another diplomatic exchange where Secretary of State Blinken was going to go to China. And this administration thinks the more meetings you have, the more successful your diplomacy is. But in fact, every time that American officials in the Biden administration meet the Chinese humiliate them, read them the Riot Act. So the idea that the administration thought they were going to get away with this, that's even more upsetting.
So if indeed there was a balloon that Trump knew about during his administration, or if Donald Trump was our president right now, being that you have firsthand knowledge of this, what would have happened to that balloon under a Trump administration, and how would it have gone differently than under this current one?
Here's what would have happened. Number one, it would have been shot out of the sky. And if it hadn't been shot out, maybe we would have somehow towed it to ground and we would have used the intelligence information. But President Trump told me one time, he said, when I was president, the reason you never heard from Putin, you never heard from the Chinese president, he said, I told him both. He said, I said to Putin, if you go into Ukraine, I'm going to nuke Moscow. And he said, and I said the same thing to the Chinese president about Taiwan. And he sort of with a blink and a twinkle, he said, do you think they believed me? No, they didn't believe me. But there might have been about a 5% chance they thought I could do something retaliatory. That's what's called deterrence. And no, the Chinese would never have dared to do this during the Trump administration. And anybody in the Pentagon who's leaking information saying, it's Donald Trump did it. Donald Trump was flying the balloon. It's hogwash. Trump and none of us would have tolerated this for a minute.
And during that entire Trump administration, it was very clear that the world was fearful of Donald Trump. Our allies felt protected by our country and our strength of our country, not because we were going to hand them a blank check necessarily, but because we were strong. Mm-hmm. And when the United States is strong, you don't have to hand out tanks and blank checks. You have peace through strength, which is the exact opposite of what we're dealing with now. But I want to know what you think the motivation is, besides just China flexing its muscle because Biden is weak. What do you think the larger picture is here? What message are they trying to send us, and what should we be prepared for in the coming months or even the coming years from China?
This is the important question that everybody's not really talking about with this whole balloon thing is what's really going on here. The Chinese have every intention of replacing the United States economically, politically, militarily, technologically. They want to take Taiwan in the next several years. They don't want to do it with a war. They want to do it because Taiwan capitulates, because Taiwan has no other choice. And what has our response been to all of this? Well, the Chinese, as Joe Biden said when he ran for election to president the first time, he said, China, they can't eat our lunch. They're really good guys. They're our friends. No, they're not. And we should wake up to the fact that the Chinese, within a very short period of time, plan to replace the United States as the dominant world power, rewrite the rules of order, and push us into the position of a has-been nation. They believe to their bones that the United States is in inevitable decline and that they are inevitably going to rule the world. And that's why it's so important for any American of any political party to say, okay, what steps are we going to take now? We're not just going to criticize them. We've got some very specific things we need to do, like we did in the Reagan administration, where I was a member. You rebuild your defenses. You make sure that our technology is superior. You make sure you don't let the Chinese steal or buy our technology. You don't let them push us around all over the world. And you use the one thing that America's really good at, which is our trade, our technology, our economy, and our alliance system, to check China at every single step. We're not doing any of that stuff.
Well, there's some more questions about exactly why we're not doing that, but I want to get into something that you said as well, because you mentioned they don't necessarily want to go to war. They don't want to take Taiwan. They don't want to go to war head to head with the USA. However, they're doing things that, to me, and I'm sure to you, shows that they are infiltrating us in a much I think a much more subtle way. One, as I already mentioned, TikTok. Even if they're not spying on you through TikTok, they're melting children's brains with TikTok, and they're teaching their students and their young people to be superior and highly educated. Meanwhile, our students are getting dumber. If not for COVID and being masked and remote learning for years at a time, which also, ding, 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 China made. But now they've got TikTok making people stupid. They're buying up farmland. Now they got balloons in the sky. I mean, it's a little things here and there, and it's piling up to the point where I don't know how anybody couldn't see it's right in front of our face. But I wonder, with this president, with his son, with what we know from that laptop, what we know about the big guy and some of these trips over to China and these diplomats that they were meeting with that were probably highly compromised, What part do you think that plays into this and how Joe Biden's reacting to that nation?
The important thing to remember is countries don't want to go to war. They want their objectives, but they don't want to have to fight for them. So the best thing the United States could do is to show China how impossible it would be for them to win in Taiwan. That's what they're trying to show us, that, well, we could take Taiwan. That's why they're having all these military maneuverings around Taiwan to show the rest of the world, well, don't even try to help Taiwan because we've got it notched. The important thing for the United States is, as you pointed out, is peace through strength. We don't want to have, and that means economic, military, all sorts of strength. It doesn't just mean go to war strength. And peace means a lot of different things. Peace is when the other guy decides it's not worth it or he can't prevail. That's called deterrence. And that's what we should be doing. And we are not doing. In fact, the opposite has happened. And with regard to why is this administration just so stuck in the sand? I mean, why are they not recognizing what everyone else can see? I just keep, people said initially, oh, well, maybe Biden was compromised. And I kind of thought, well, maybe that's a little overreaction. But look at the Penn Biden Center, which is where these supposedly classified documents were stored. Who else was at that Penn Center? Well, the Chinese bought it. They paid for it. And then all of the senior officials in the Biden administration were there. They were people who were senior officials in the Obama administration. So they kind of went to the Biden Center where they were basically indirectly paid by the Chinese government. And so why are they so soft on China? Why do they refuse to acknowledge, as you point out, that TikTok's trying to melt the brains of our kids? I don't know. Are they compromised? So far, they haven't proved to me that they're not compromised.
That's what's truly scary to me, is there are a lot of things that when we even talk about them, we get immediately dismissed as conspiracy theorists, but it's very real information with a lot of facts to back all that up that we don't know if we're ever going to know, because there seems to be a giant lack of transparency. But you mentioned our military, greatest military in the world. However, we've seen some declines in our military, not because of the men and women serving and our valiant mission and what they've been able to do, but because of the curriculum, so to speak. They're pushing this wokeness, this diversity, inclusion, LGBTQ. Everything is about, training them to be aware of white supremacy at every turn. It feels like our military is also being compromised, but not by any other country, from within, by a woke agenda that is nothing more than a social experiment. Do you have some concerns about that down the line?
Yeah, the Chinese understand that the way you conquer a society is from within. That's TikTok. That's all the things that are encouraging the United States basically to hate the United States. But what the military is doing is helping them on their goal. The whole, woke thing that the military is just so consumed with. If you're a military officer, if you're a military enlisted man or woman, you only have so many hours of a day to prepare, to be a warfighter, to study, to learn new equipment. But if you're busy spending a good and increasing percentage of your time dealing with the woke agenda, what falls out of the bottom of that curriculum? Warfighting agenda. And that's why I think we're seeing a real issue with any of the war games the Pentagon is showing. It's normal for the Pentagon to do war gaming every possible contingency, but they're war gaming. What would happen in Asia if the United States and China went to war over Taiwan, over the Western Pacific? What would happen? And the war games all show the United States does not prevail. And that should be a giant wake-up call to the Pentagon and to the U.S. military to let's focus on warfighting capability. That's what we're supposed to be all about. We're spending almost $1 trillion a year to become the best military in the world and maintain our edge. But somehow that is fallen away from the wayside. And it's far more important for military personnel to be concerned about the woke agenda than it is about defending the country. Or, case in point, looking up in the air and seeing a spy balloon penetrating American airspace. They don't protect our border. They don't protect our skies. What are they doing?
Well, exactly. And that is also a very strong message that we're sending to China, that they have better control and overwatch over our country than we do. But I saw a meme over the weekend and, I had to chuckle at it, but then I started to think about it and, it kind of rings true. It was, if that spy balloon was over Ukraine, we would have shot that thing down on sight, because we are far more concerned with protecting Ukraine. So that's my last question for you. I know there's a lot of debate, and it's not necessarily along party lines, which most of these discussions are. A lot of Republicans also believe in sending a blank check to Ukraine, or more accurately, in my opinion, to Zelensky. What do you see this as, and do you see this being a winnable strategy for the United States, for Ukraine? What happens here if we just continue to send tanks, unlimited money and funds and supplies and resources? How does this end?
It's important to understand that wars are expensive and we're paying for this war. It's important to understand that Russia is paying for this war because of high energy prices. Russia does one thing. They export oil and natural gas. They make a lot of money from it. When oil prices are high, the Russians have historically rebuilt their military, invaded their neighbors, and fought proxy wars. When energy prices are low, the Russians can't afford to do any of those things. So if we, the United States, really wanted to clip Putin, really wanted to end this war, we would end the American war on fossil fuels. The United States would not just be energy independent, we would be energy dominant. And that would drive the price of oil and natural gas down, be terrific for our economy. It would bankrupt the Russians. So Putin could dream all he wants about a Ukraine war. He couldn't afford it. That's the way to win that war.
I love that because that's something that everyone should be able to get behind. That is an America First agenda, but it's also an agenda that keeps the world safer. But I got to tell you, KT, when I look at everything going on with Ukraine and I see Zelensky come to speak before Congress wearing a tracksuit and complaining that we're not sending him more money, it boils my blood as an average American. And I don't see why we continue to hemorrhage funds to Zelensky, especially when they don't have the banking infrastructure that allows us to really know how these funds are being used, where they're going, and to really audit this spending. But I know that you know far more than me. So do you think that what we're doing right now and the money that we've spent thus far, do you think that was a smart move? And should we send more? Should we be sending tanks? Is that the point that we are in this, I guess, this war that we're fighting for Ukraine?
Look, I don't think the United States should go to World War III over Ukraine. I think we should let the Ukrainians fight. We should give them the stuff. But we should understand that when we support and supply Ukraine, it shouldn't come at the expense of our own national security. No, it should not. The tanks that we send shouldn't come from our stockpile of tanks. So if the president were real about this, he would go to Congress and say, look, we're spending a lot of money on Ukraine. It's coming out of the defense budget, essentially. What we need to do is understand that that should be separate. We shouldn't cannibalize the American military to give it to Ukraine. The other thing I would say is I don't see how Ukraine wins this war while Russia continues to have unlimited forces, supplies, and windfall profits to fight this war. But I do think Ukraine could win the peace, and here's how they would win it. If the fighting stopped, neither side gets all they want, just enough to live with. And then what happens after the fighting stops? The world rushes in to rebuild Ukraine. I mean, every country, every company in the world, there'll be $1 trillion that goes into Ukraine to rebuild their agricultural resources, to rebuild their manufacturing base, to rebuild their very wealthy natural resources. So within a couple of years of the peace, Ukraine is fully integrated into Europe. They're in NATO. They're in the European economy. Meanwhile, where's Russia 3 years after the peace? They're broke. Presumably, a new American president pushes the price of oil down and makes us energy independent and bankrupts the Russians. So the Russians are broke. They're a pariah state. Nobody's going to side up with Russia against Europe. And that's how you win the peace. It's not just the fighting today. It's looking forward. How do you get your objectives? As I worked with President Reagan, how do you achieve your objectives without firing a shot? You use the American economic weapon. That's how to win the peace.
Those are great tools, and I just hope that we can move towards that while we still have this president in office and we don't have to wait 2 more years. But I'm not going to hold my breath. Katie, thank you so much for thank you so much for all this information that you've given us and given me. It's so great to see you, and please come back anytime.